It was the spring of 2009 when 29-year-old Lena Marsh found herself the sole heir to a failing apple orchard in rural Vermont. 340 acres of frostbitten trees, a broken-down cider press, and a debt she hadn't known existed. Until the lawyer read the will out loud. Her mother had died quietly on a Tuesday, the kind of death that doesn't announce itself. Eleanor Marsh had simply sat down in the wooden chair by the kitchen window, the one that looked out over the oldest row of trees, and by the time Lena drove up from Burlington that evening, the paramedics were already folding their equipment away. There was nothing dramatic about it, just absence where there had always been presence. Lena had grown up in that house, but she had also left it. She'd left for college, for a job at a packaging firm in Burlington, for a life that ran on Wi-Fi and quarterly reports instead of frost charts and soil pH. She had come home for holidays, for apple-picking weekends in October, when the light turned amber and everything smelled of wood smoke and fermented fruit. But she had not come home to stay, not until there was no one else left. The orchard was called Marsh Hill. It had been her grandfather's name for it, and the name had stuck through 3 generations, the way old names do in Vermont. Not because anyone decided to keep it, but because no one bothered to change it. Her grandfather, August Marsh, had planted the first trees in 1951. Her mother had taken over in 1987 when his hands got too stiff to prune, and now it was Lena's, whether she wanted it or not. The day after the funeral, a man in a gray sedan pulled into the driveway. He was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with the pressed collar and careful smile of someone who delivers news for a living. He introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell, a loan officer from the Agricultural Lending Office in Montpelier. He had sent letters, he explained gently to her mother. Several letters, over the past 2 years. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and opened a folder. The operating line of credit was past due. The equipment notes, the cider press, the commercial cold storage unit her mother had financed 6 years ago, were in arrears. There was also the small matter of a delinquent property tax bill from the previous year. Eleanor, he said in his careful voice, had been struggling quietly for some time. She hadn't told anyone. Lena looked at the numbers. She was an accountant by training. Numbers didn't frighten her in the abstract, but these numbers, laid out on a kitchen table she had eaten breakfast at every morning for 18 years, felt different. They felt personal. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat. There is also, he said, an interested party, a development group out of Hartford. They've been acquiring orchard properties across the Northeast, converting them. Condominiums, mostly, or mixed use. They've already made an informal inquiry about Marsh Hill. Given the acreage and the location, the offer would be substantial. He said the word substantial the way people say it when they want you to understand that the conversation is really over, that the only remaining question is logistics. Lena set down the folder. She looked out the kitchen window at the oldest row of trees, the ones her grandfather had planted by hand. They were still bare. Spring in Vermont comes when it wants to, not when you want it to. "I'm not selling," she said. Mr. Caldwell blinked. He had the practiced expression of a man who has heard that sentence before and knows what usually comes after it. He said, very politely, that he understood her emotional attachment to the property. He said that sentiment was a natural response to grief. He said that the practical reality of operating a 340-acre orchard without capital, without equipment in working order, and without experience in commercial agriculture was frankly prohibitive. "The press will run this fall," Lena said. "The loans will be current by December." He looked at her for a long moment. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had sat at enough kitchen tables to know how these stories usually ended. He left his card. He said his door was open. He said she should think carefully. She walked him to his car, came back inside, and stood alone in her mother's kitchen for a long time. Then she went to find her grandfather's notebooks. Let me tell you about August Marsh, because you cannot understand what happened next without understanding him first. August Marsh was not a sentimental man. He was a practical one, which is a different thing entirely. He had come back from Korea in 1952 with 2 functioning legs, 1 partially deaf ear, and an absolute conviction that the only thing worth trusting was something you could hold in your hands or work with your own body. He didn't believe in credit. He didn't believe in the government's farm subsidy programs that his neighbors lined up for every year. He didn't believe in throwing money at a problem when knowledge would do. What he believed in was this: the trees. He had learned pomaculture, the science of apple growing, the hard way, from books and from failure and from 20 years of watching what the land told him. He had learned that Macintosh apples wanted heavier soil and Honeycrisps needed excellent drainage. He had learned that fire blight traveled on the wind after a warm, wet spring, and that the only defense was to prune aggressively in February before the bacteria woke up. He had learned that a cider press running 10 degrees too warm would flatten the tannins in a dry cider and make it taste like juice. He didn't teach his daughter these things in any formal way. He taught her the way country people teach, by doing, by pointing, by saying, "Watch here," and asking, "What do you notice?" And Eleanor had learned, and she had taught Lena the same way, in the same orchards, under the same trees, during those October weekends that Lena now realized had not been vacations but a curriculum. She just hadn't known she was enrolled. August had kept a journal, not a diary. He would have rejected that word as too soft, but a working record. 3 notebooks, their covers stained with the particular dark green of apple sap and Vermont rain. In them, in the dense, cramped handwriting of a man who had never wasted anything in his life, he had recorded every significant thing that had happened to every tree on the property since 1953. He noted frosts and their dates. He noted disease outbreaks and what had stopped them. He noted soil amendments, irrigation adjustments, the specific variety yields by row. For every harvest, he had cross-referenced his own observations against the Extension Service bulletins. He'd kept filed in a manila folder at the back of each notebook. He had also recorded his failures. This was the thing that struck Lena most, reading through them that first week. He had not only written down what worked, he had written down what didn't and why and what he had learned from it. Lost the entire northeast block to root rot in 1968. Wrong drainage. Replanted 1969 with raised beds. See diagram. No loss since. Lena read those notebooks for 3 days straight. Have you ever looked at something you thought you knew and realized you'd been seeing only the surface of it? That is what those notebooks did to her. She had thought she was coming home to manage a crisis. She was actually inheriting a methodology, a way of seeing. She made a list of what was broken. The cider press, a hydraulic rack and cloth system, had a failing pump seal. The cold storage unit had a condenser issue that was causing temperature fluctuation, meaning last fall's stored crop had partially spoiled before she got there. The tractor, a 1998 New Holland, had a cracked injector line on the 3rd cylinder, which meant it was running rough and burning more fuel than it should. She had been an accountant, not a mechanic, but she had also watched her grandfather take apart a carburetor and aver on the kitchen table when she was 8 years old, explaining each part as he set it on the newspaper he'd laid out. To catch the grease, because that was simply what you did when something broke and you didn't have money to throw at it. She called the hydraulic press manufacturer. The customer service line put her through to a technician who, after she described the symptoms, the pressure cycling without building, The faint oil smell near the base of the pump told her it was almost certainly a failed shaft seal, and that the part number was HP4471S, and that she could order it from 3 different suppliers. $42. She ordered 2. She watched 2 YouTube tutorials about replacing hydraulic pump seals. This is a detail August Marsh would have found remarkable and probably hilarious, learning a trade from a screen, and on a cold Thursday morning in early April, she drained the pump reservoir, laid the parts out on a clean tarp in the order she would need them, and replaced the seal herself. It took 4 hours. When she refilled the reservoir and cycled the press, the pressure held. She stood in the cold barn and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not pride exactly, steadiness. The specific steadiness that comes from solving a problem with your own hands. From the knowledge that the thing in front of you is fixed because of what you know and what you did, not because of a check you wrote to someone else. She called a refrigeration contractor for the condenser, because that was electrical, and she drew her line at electrical. He came, diagnosed a failing capacitor and a refrigerant leak at a valve fitting, and fixed both for $480. She paid him with the last of her savings account, the tractor she drove to a small engine shop in the next town over. A man named Mr. Sorensen, in his 60s, with the kind of hands that have been permanently stained by diesel, looked at it for 20 minutes and told her the injector line replacement was about 2 hours of labor and $80 in parts. He looked at her when she paid the estimate and said, "Your mother was a good customer, real steady." He said it simply, the way men of that generation compliment women, matter-of-factly, without flourish. "I know," Lena said. The first spring passed in a blur of physical work that she had not known her body could sustain. She was in the orchard by 6 in the morning, and out of it only when the light failed completely. Her mother had employed 2 seasonal workers for pruning, but Lena couldn't afford that yet. So she pruned the northeast block herself, working from her grandfather's diagrams and his notes on which trees had shown fire blight vulnerability in previous years. She wore knee pads and a headlamp for the early morning rows. Her shoulders ached in ways she hadn't known shoulders could ache. There was a moment in late April. I want you to feel this with me, because it matters. When she was in the oldest row of trees, the ones August had planted in 1951. The trees were beginning to bud, tiny pale green points of color on branches that had been bare and gray all winter. She was working on the 6th tree in the row. She knew them individually by now, the way you come to know the specific personality of old things, and she found a branch that had been damaged over the winter, probably an ice storm. The wood split halfway along its length. She stood there looking at it for a long time. The damage was too extensive. She would have to remove the branch entirely. She made the cut, and then she stood there in the cold April morning, with the branch in her hands, and something broke open in her chest yet. She cried for her mother. She cried for her grandfather. She cried for the fact that this tree had been alive since before she was born, and she was only just now beginning to understand what that meant. She put the branch down. She kept working. That is the thing no one tells you about grief and about hard work. They do not cancel each other out. They coexist. You carry the weight and you do the work simultaneously, and after a while you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. The harvest that fall was modest. She had brought the press back to working order, but she couldn't run it and manage the orchard alone, so she hired one part-time worker for the 6 weeks of peak season, a young man from the next town, over who needed cash and didn't mind early mornings. She pressed 1,200 gallons of cider, bottled under the Marsh Hill, label her grandfather had designed in 1974, a label so unstylish it had become In recent years, fashionable. She sold at the Burlington Farmers Market every Saturday from September through November. She sold a portion wholesale to 2 local restaurant accounts she'd cold called, pitching herself at back doors with samples in paper cups. Every dollar that wasn't food, fuel, or the minimum loan payment went to the debt. She didn't buy a new laptop when hers got slow. She fixed the wireless card herself, following a tutorial. She didn't buy a winter coat. She found her mother's old Carhartt in the mudroom closet. She called Mr. Caldwell in December. She read him the figures. The operating line was current. The equipment notes were reduced by 30%. The property taxes were paid in full. There was a pause on the line. "That's," he said, and then stopped. "That's better than I expected," he said. "I know," she said. The second year was harder in ways that didn't show in any ledger. Vermont winters are not decorative. They are long and gray and relentless, and there is a particular quality to the silence of a farmhouse in February when you are the only person in it. Lena had been to Burlington twice since September. She had seen her friends from her old life a handful of times, occasions that felt increasingly like visits to a country she used to live in. They talked about things: restaurants, office politics, a new development going up on the waterfront, and she listened and nodded and felt the distance between them as a physical sensation. She was not lonely exactly, but she was alone, and the distinction between those two things required constant maintenance. The lowest point came in February of her second year, a freezing rain event. The forecasters had predicted light precipitation, came in overnight and kept coming for 16 hours. By morning, the orchard was encased in ice. Tree limbs were breaking under the weight. She could hear them from inside the house, the sharp crack and crash of branches coming down in the dark, and there was nothing she could do. She couldn't work in that. She could only listen. She drove out at first light to assess the damage. The ice caught the early sun and turned the whole orchard into something surreal and terrible, beautiful in the way that disasters sometimes are, when the scale of them is too large to process as loss. She walked the rows for 2 hours, cataloging what was gone. The Cortland block had lost perhaps a fifth of its canopy. 2 of the oldest Macintosh trees in the original 1951 planting had lost major limbs. 1 tree had split entirely at the trunk. She came back inside, sat down at the kitchen table where Mr. Caldwell had sat, and put her hands flat on the surface of it. The Hartford developers were still interested. Mr. Caldwell had mentioned it again in the fall, casually, as if he were simply keeping her informed. The offer had gone up. It was, by any reasonable standard, a great deal of money. She sat at that table for a long time. Then she went to the shelf in the back hallway where her grandfather's notebooks lived, and she took down the second one, the middle years, the one that covered 1963 through 1974. She opened it to the winter of 1969, the entry she had read half a dozen times already. Ice storm, February 14, 1969. Lost 22 trees in the northeast block, 9 in the south row. First assessment, catastrophic. Second assessment, root systems intact, healthy root systems. Damaged trees not dead. Pruned hard in March, full canopy recovery in 3 to 4 years. Note: ice storms reveal which trees have weak branch structure. This is, in its way, useful information. She read that last line twice. This is, in its way, useful information. She put the notebook back. She went and found her pruning saw. She started the list of what needed to come down and what could be saved. "The work is the answer," she said, to no one. It was not a phrase she'd read anywhere. It was something she felt arriving in her chest the way convictions sometimes do, not chosen, but recognized. By the third year, the numbers had begun to move in a direction that felt like something other than emergency. Her cider had found a following. A food writer for a regional magazine, had come to the farm in October and written about Marsh Hill in the kind of prose that moves product. She mentioned the 1951 trees, the original label, the fact that Lena pressed with abandoned varieties of apple that the larger commercial operations had stopped growing decades ago. The piece ran in November. Her wholesale accounts tripled in January. She had also done something her grandfather had done, and her mother had continued. She held the soil. She did not rototill aggressively in the fall, the way the orchard management guides suggested. She let the grass grow between the tree rows, only mowing it down in spring. She kept a modest flock of chickens that ranged through the orchard in the off-season. Because her grandfather had noted in 1966 that the insect pressure in the chicken-ranged blocks was measurably lower than in the others. She composted everything. She used copper sulfate for fire blight, cautiously, minimally, the way August had taught by example, instead of the heavier fungicide programs the Extension Service recommended. Her yields were not the highest in the county, but her trees were healthy, and her input costs were low, and there was a consistency to her harvests that the bigger, more chemically aggressive operations were beginning to lose as their soils compacted and their resistance pressures built. She was not farming. She was partnering. The distinction was her grandfather's. It was a Tuesday in October of the third year when Mr. Caldwell's gray sedan appeared in the driveway again. She saw it from the orchard and walked down to meet him, her pruning shears in her hand and apple debris in her hair. He got out of the car and looked at the orchard for a moment before he looked at her. The trees were heavy with fruit. The Honeycrisps in the south block glowed red gold in the afternoon light. It was the kind of October afternoon that Vermont does on purpose, as if to remind you why anyone would choose to stay. He said, "I've driven past here a few times over the past couple of years. I want you to know that." She said nothing. She waited. "Your yields this year," he said. "I have the agricultural data from the county." He shook his head slightly. "You're outperforming operations twice your size on acreage that I had written off." She looked at him. She was not angry. She had been angry in the first year. The tight, cold anger of someone who has been underestimated. But that had burned away somewhere in the second winter, replaced by something quieter and more useful. Mr. Caldwell reached into his car and retrieved a document she recognized as a loan modification. He placed it on the hood of the sedan. He had already signed his section. "This restructures your remaining balance at a lower rate," he said, "and I want to say—" He paused, as men of his profession pause when they are about to say something that is not in the script. "I was wrong to push the sale. I was looking at a balance sheet. I should have looked at what your family built here over 60 years. He extended his hand. She wiped her hand on her work pants and shook it. She didn't tell him that the night before, she had been in the barn at midnight, checking the cold storage temperature logs, and that standing in the cold with her phone screen illuminating the data, she had thought, "I could have sold this. I almost sold this." The thought had arrived with the specific terror of a near miss, the way you feel after a car barely misses you, and you stand on the curb for a moment just breathing. She had gone back to the house, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table until she felt steady again. There was another visitor that winter. She hadn't expected this one. A car she didn't recognize pulled in on a Friday evening in December, when the orchard was dormant and the light failed at 4 in the afternoon. A man she almost didn't recognize got out, because the last time she had seen him, he had been in the context of her old life, the Burlington life, the life that had seemed like the real one. His name was Marcus, and he had been the one she'd been seeing for 3 years before her mother died, the one who had said, when she told him she was going back to run the orchard, that he couldn't wait for her to get it out of her system. She had not called him after that. She had not needed to. He stood by his car and looked at the place the way people look at things that have proved them wrong, with a complicated expression that was somewhere between admiration and the particular kind of regret that knows it's too late to be useful. "I heard from Sarah," he said, "about the magazine piece." He gestured vaguely at the orchard, the farmhouse, all of it. "About what you did here." She stood on the porch and said nothing. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was flat with the sincerity of someone who has rehearsed this but means it anyway. "I thought it was grief making you impulsive. I thought the sensible thing was, too." He stopped. "I thought I knew what the sensible thing was." She looked at him for a long time. The cold was the particular sharp, dry cold of Vermont in December, and the sky behind him was going dark in that fast, decisive way it does in winter, the blue deepening toward black in the space of minutes. "I know you were," she said, and then, because she felt it and it was true, "I don't think you were a bad person for it. You just didn't know what this was." He nodded. He didn't ask to come in and she didn't invite him. He got back in his car after another moment, and she watched the taillights disappear down the gravel drive, and she stood there in the cold for a little while before she went inside. She had been vindicated, twice now, by the people who had told her to leave. She had learned something from it that she hadn't expected to learn. Vindication does not feel the way you imagine it will when you are in the middle of the hardest part. You imagine it will feel like triumph. It feels instead like settling, like the final piece of something clicking into place. She went back inside. She made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with her grandfather's third notebook, the late years, the one that covered 1975 through his last harvest in 2003, and she read until she fell asleep in the chair. "Let me take you forward a few years. Lena Marsh is 36 now. The orchard is still 340 acres. She never expanded through debt, never bought the adjacent parcel when it came up for sale in 2014, though Mr. Caldwell had called her about it. She had done the math and decided against it. Her grandfather had always said that the temptation to get bigger was the enemy of getting better, and she had seen enough of the regional orchard industry collapse under exactly that logic to believe him. What she had done instead was deepen. She had diversified her varieties, bringing back 6 heritage apple types that had essentially disappeared from commercial production. Varieties with names like Blue Pearmain and Roxbury Russet and Esopus Spitzenberg, apples that serious cider makers and chefs would pay a significant premium for. She had installed a simple drip irrigation system in the most vulnerable blocks. She had added a small farm store at the end of the driveway, nothing elaborate, a converted equipment shed with good light that ran on an honor system in the afternoons during harvest season. The orchard was known now, not famous. It was 340 acres in Vermont, not a media property, but known in the way that things built on craft and consistency become known, slowly, deeply, by the people for whom it matters. She had also hired, over time, 2 full-time employees who stayed year-round, and a seasonal crew of 4. The employment felt to her like a form of responsibility she had earned, rather than assumed. She paid them well, better than the regional average, because she remembered what it had felt like to run on nothing, and she had decided that she would not build the place on the exhaustion of people, the way some operations did. On a late September afternoon, she was in the original 1951 block, the oldest trees on the property, showing her newest hire, a young woman just out of an agricultural program at UVM, earnest and slightly overwhelmed. The particular way her grandfather had trained the canopy structure on these trees. Open center, August had always insisted. Let the light in. Light is not the enemy of yield. Shade is the enemy of yield. The young woman had questions, smart ones, and Lena answered them from the notebooks, and from the decades of her family's accumulated knowledge, and from 6 years of her own hard-won experience, which had added a layer to the record she now kept in a notebook of her own. Same style, different handwriting, the same methodical accounting of what the trees told her every year. At one point, the young woman asked, "Why do you keep doing it on paper? Wouldn't a database be better?" Lena considered this genuinely. "A database might be more searchable," she said. "But when I'm standing in the orchard at 6 in the morning and I want to know what my grandfather observed about this specific tree in a specific year, I want to hold the same notebook he held. I want to feel the weight of it. I think there's something in that." She paused. "And also," she said, "it doesn't need Wi-Fi." The young woman laughed. Lena handed her a pair of pruning shears and pointed to a branch that had crossed into the canopy interior, blocking the light. "Show me what you do here," she said. "Take your time, look first." The young woman looked. She tilted her head. She made the cut. "Good," Lena said. "Now, why?" "Because the interior needs light," the young woman said. "And that branch is taking it," Lena nodded. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole thing. The tree will tell you what it needs. You just have to be patient enough to look before you cut." She said it the way her mother had said it, the way her grandfather had said it, the way things that are true tend to travel. Not from books or programs, but from hand to hand, from one cold orchard morning to the next, carried forward by the people who stayed. The men who had told her to sell had been wrong. The man who had thought the sensible thing was to leave had been wrong. The lender who had seen a crisis instead of a legacy had been wrong. They had all looked at Marsh Hill and seen a problem to be resolved, a liability to be shed, a sentiment to be outgrown. What they had failed to see was what August Marsh had known since 1951, and what Eleanor had known after him, and what Lena now knew down to the marrow of her, that you do not inherit land. You inherit the knowledge of how to care for it, and that knowledge, kept and practiced and passed on, is the only thing that outlasts the price of anything.